Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Hello and welcome to you all, the Andrew Lawton Show. It is midway through the week, just after 1 p.m. Eastern Time on Wednesday, June 10th, 12th, 10th, 12th, 12th, 10th, 11th, 14th, who knows. June 12th, I think it is. But it is good to have you aboard the program, regardless of wherever in this fine country or world you are coming from, whenever you're listening. I don't often do this, but we'll start off with a bit of a plug, because I know that a lot of you like watching me inexplicably. Some of you prefer to listen to me, but you can subscribe to the podcast. We generally focus more on the video product, as evidenced by me saying, as you can see on your screen, which I realize if you're tuning into the podcast, well, you're a long-haul truck driver, is a bit, I'll try to be a bit more descriptive about it, but you can do subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, the Google Store, anywhere you get your podcasts, and leave it a good rating if you don't mind too, because it's either like us or Peter Mansbridge's podcast, and I don't know why that was the one I came up with as a rival. He actually, Peter Mansbridge, to his credit, had me on his show a couple of weeks back when my new book came out. So I'm grateful for that. But whatever it is that you are doing today, we are going to hopefully not rile you up too much, as politics sometimes does. I figured we do a bit of a lighter one here, because there's a lot of serious stuff that's been going on. What is more amusing than listening to the NDP just spiral into a rage, a sputtering rage, because they simply do not get where Canadians are. The NDP has always been a party, if you go back to its early years, that was a party of the workers. It had perhaps a misguided, but evidently a morally pure approach. The NDP of Tommy Douglas, the CCF before that, very different from the woke NDP that you have today, the anti-freedom, pro-tax, pro-government, pro-big government NDP, which again, just does not stand up for the working class, which is why you've seen in, not just in Canada, in general, a lot of these left-wing parties have had labor, big labor, which they always used to rely on, break with them. The Conservatives in Ontario under Doug Ford have done very well picking up private sector unionized workers, the demographic that Pierre Poilievre is doing somewhat well with as well. Because again, if you're like the average blue-collar unionized worker in Hamilton, Ontario, London, Ontario, in British Columbia, wherever it is, you are probably not interested in the they, them, she, jim, jer wokeness. You're actually just interested in jobs. You're interested in building. You're interested in construction. So why on earth would you, as an NDPer, go along with a party that has just absolutely rejected that sense of purity? And even Jack Layton, I used to have a lot of stuff that I disagreed with about with Jack Layton, but Jack Layton, I never doubted his commitment to a cohesive set of principles. Jagmeet Singh is absolutely the opposite of that. He has no real principles. He's managed to squander the opportunity of being one of the most powerful men in Canadian politics and trade it for absolutely nothing. What has he gotten from the Liberals but free birth control for some folks and free diabetes medications and pretty much nothing else? So I wanted to talk about that as a bit of context here before getting into a clip that I wanted to share with you. I understand the clip's not ready, so I'll do a lengthier one. Oh, it's ready now. Okay. So this is from a member of parliament who is a New Democrat, and her name is, she's not like one of the top ones. She's not one of the top ones that we usually talk about. She's not one of the most prominent ones, but her name is Bonita. And this, I forget what's her last name again. She's that irrelevant right now. I've forgotten her last name, and I don't see it on my list. Benita Zarrillo. And she has this very dystopian view of what a conservative government led by Pierre Poilievre would mean for Canadian women. Take a look.
Mr. Speaker, the member and I went to the same high school, and in grade 10, the required reading was The Handmaid's Tale. It was hard to read, Mr. Speaker, and I'll tell you what else is difficult to read what's happening down in the United States and the fact that the United States is looking at taking away a woman's right to choose. And I think about the fact that the member is courting incels for months and months and months at a time, and that the last conservative from Port Moody Coquitlam was an anti-abortionist. I want to know for sure today, right now, does the member support a woman's right to choose? And is the member going to take away a woman's right to choose if they ever, and I hope it never happens, becomes a government in this country?
Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
No.
That's quite the response there. Not even a Mr. Speaker no, just a no. Just a stand up, say no, and sit back down. What a way to neutralize and basically deflate this big, lengthy, sputtering, rage-induced wind-up that Pierre Poilievre, she implies, if he gets in, he's going to turn Canada into the Republic of Gilead from The Handmaid's Tale. This is from the Margaret Atwood novel, then the, I think it was a Hulu show in the US. It's now on Crave. Don't give me any spoilers. My wife and I are still watching Handmaid's Tale, but I don't look at The Handmaid's Tale and think Pierre Poilievre, this seems to be what he wants. Yeah, Pierre Poilievre, I actually think this is what he wants. So the premise of it is that you have any fertile women in Gilead become, or not any of them, but most of them become handmaids, and these handmaids are assigned to, people whose wives can't get pregnant, and then, they do this weird ritual where every month the commander of the household does a ceremony with the handmaid, which you can probably glean what it is from, and if the handmaid gets pregnant, everyone celebrates it, but it's no longer the handmaid's child. So, again, it's a weird thing to have to describe, and I'm curious exactly what about that Benita Zarrillo thinks Pierre Poilievre is doing to Canada. I'm not quite getting from A to Z there like she is. And by the way, her only bit of evidence is there are some Americans who are pro-life. Ergo, Pierre Poilievre wants to turn Canada into a religious fundamentalist cult-like country. Okay, yep, I see how you got there. This is, I think, a bit of a bizarro world thing. But then, again, you go to the more substantive point of this, which is that there is this fear, this terror, this fear that Pierre Poilievre is going to roll back abortion in Canada. Now, there are a great many pro-life Canadians, and I'm pro-life myself, who would probably love a government that would do something like this. But Poilievre himself has been so unequivocally clear he has no interest in doing this. This came up last week or 2 weeks ago when Arnold Bierson, the Conservative Member of Parliament, did a podcast interview, and he talked about his own view on social conservative issues. And Poilievre came out not long after with a statement saying, listen, we're going nowhere near. I've been clear. We are not going to reopen this matter. But the Liberals are getting desperate. The New Democrats are getting desperate. We may recall this one press conference where the Liberals just trotted out, again, inexplicably. It had no basis in anything other than they were pointing to the United States and just trying to import this into Canada. But they came out and had this massive press conference of Liberal MPs. Again, the same sort of unhinged attacks on Pierre Poilievre. Take a look.
We've sent a letter to the Leader of the Opposition asking him to be very clear with Canadians, and in particular with Canadian women, on what he would do to defend a woman's right to choose. We've seen that his caucus, there are many anti-choice caucus members. We've seen some of their actions recently, including MP Kathy Wagenthal, who at the pro-life rally held here last week said that women who have abortions end up needing redemption, forgiveness, and needing God. That caucus and that leader has made women wonder about the risk that they're going to be taking with this leader. And I want him to come out and unequivocally say that they do everything to defend a woman's right to choose, that they will not allow their members to come forward with private members' bills and put forward bills that suggest that a fetus is a person, which is a backdoor way of, again, addressing this issue.
The Harper government had 10 years. I know you weren't here. Many of us were. 10 years in power. They had 4 years as a majority, didn't move one bit. And they had private members who wanted to do things and do things. Guys, you are all 30 points down the polls. I'm looking at some of you will not get reelected if there was an election this fall. This is the most cynical play to just throw the abortion scare tactic. Would you like to respond to that observation?
Absolutely. It's
Please.
Not a scare tactic. We've seen what's happened in the States. Do people really think Roe versus Wade would have been overturned? Do we think what was happening there was going to happen? I've been in the women's movement for over 50 years. It is not a scare tactic.
Very, very offended she got when she was called on this. It's not a scare tactic. No, just look at what's happening in the United States. Yes, that is a different country, believe it or not, with a different government, with different political parties, with different priorities. And again, I'm one of these people who believes Canada should be able to have a discussion about abortion. It should not be, as the Liberals have made it, as the media has made it, this tremendous third rail issue where we're not allowed to talk about an issue that a great many Canadians of Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, Buddhist faith, people of no faith at all, have a variety of opinions on. This idea that it should be instantly disqualified in the Liberals' eyes or the NDP's eyes if someone happens to, shockingly believe that life is important, I find to be a tragedy. But as we talk about this issue, and we need to, you have to look at how the Liberals are approaching this. And to them, it's not about, they don't even care about supporting women. They do not care about supporting women. They love driving a wedge that makes conservatives get all antsy because they don't know how to talk about these issues. That's what the Liberals want to do. It's why it's like the first thing they reach into in their bag of tricks when they are down in the polls. It's basically just this little sack that they carry around, and you've got abortion, assault rifles. There are like 19 cards that just have Stephen Harper's name scrawled out in red ink. But what else do we have there? Trump. Trump has a few as well. So, basically it's like Mad Libs. They just, take, insert name of country, name of leader, name of political issue, and then they come up with this AI-generated line of attack in which they say Pierre Poilievre is going to turn Canada into Handmaid's Tale because carrots. Oh, no, put the wrong word there. And they do this every single time. Now, whatever you think of Poilievre's position on this, and I get, look, I'm pro-life. So people that don't like his position, I understand why they want to take aim at that. But he has a clarity about this. He has a clarity about this that even Aaron O'Toole, who was similarly pro-choice, and Aaron O'Toole, who was pro-life, did not have. And that, I think, sets Poilievre up in a much better way to deal with this. And I think it's clear that all of these attacks just are not landing, which is why the rest, no one asked Andrew Scheer. No one said Andrew Scheer was going to turn Canada into the Handmaid's Tale. So this is where you get into Poilievre. They're just so desperate to make something stick. They just keep on going with it, keep on ratcheting it up. And we're going to see a heck of a lot more of this as the election nears, especially if current polling holds up. Now, as far as why I'm so aghast by maybe that's a strong word, certainly why I'm so frustrated by the inability of Canadian society to have this conversation is because when you do have issues where social conservatives have been the ones leading the charge on very significant issues, like, for example, against the expansion of assisted suicide in Canada, you get the same people who just completely do not want to engage in any question about life that try to shut it down. This is an issue, just to remind you of some context. I've talked about this in the past, so I'm going to give the 45-second summary here. I have a belief in life as a Christian, but I also, as someone who survived a very nearly successful suicide attempt more than 14 years ago, or almost 14 years ago, I have a hugely deep connection to this idea that what the Liberals are doing is atrocious in trying to expand access to assisted suicide, to euthanasia, to MAiD, whatever you want to call it, to people who are struggling only with a mental illness, not someone with MS whose life is coming to its natural end as it is, but people who may get up one day and decide they don't want to end their life, and instead of them being treated for that, they are met with the government helping them with it. This is my concern about someone with a serious depression, for example, in a regime like what the Liberals are pushing Canada towards. This has been, among other issues connected to assisted suicide, been put under the microscope by a new documentary produced by the Rebel News crew, specifically Kian Simone and Sheila Gunn Reid. Here's a little glimpse at this.
And I said, how did they come to the conclusion that I was going to die? He said, because they didn't really know what to do with you.
The government of Canada is killing Canadians, and not just a few, and not just the terminally ill. Over 50,000 so far. 50,000!
There is a startling new development in the ongoing controversy around veterans being offered medical assistance in dying.
Instead of help, Are you familiar with our MAiD program? They said, well, it's better than blowing your brains out against the wall.
They essentially evicted us from our buildings because we would not participate in this government euthanasia program.
Canadians are expecting us to get the job done.
Fraser Health is refusing to give information, and because of that, the police investigation had to close. Therefore, Fraser Health is covering information up.
And we know for a fact that our people in power do not take responsibility for anything. Right. So it's a financial save, a lack of responsibility, and then it's completely easy to just offer it to vulnerable individuals, and then they're going to take it.
That is a clip of the trailer for MAiD, The Dark Side of Canadian Compassion. It came out a couple of weeks ago. The reason I didn't want to do an interview about it is because I wanted to see it first, and I had to wait to do that because I knew they were coming to Elmer, Ontario, a lovely little town not far from me, and I saw it last week at long last, and I didn't make the trailer, but I am in the documentary. I did an interview with Sheila and Kian, which I was very grateful to do, talking about my own experience here. Sheila Gunn Reid, the editor-in-chief of Rebel News, joins us now. Sheila, I know you've done quite the tour on this, so congratulations and thanks for coming on.
Yeah, it's been a grueling tour, but I think the documentary has been well received, and sometimes we're sort of met with shock because people who are fundamentally opposed to the government helping you off this mortal coil are surprised at just how bad it is out there. When we decided to make this documentary, and we put a call out for stories, but we also put a call out for fundraising. We did this all entirely without any government help, unlike many documentaries made in this country. But our emails were sort of inundated with people from two sides of the debate. We had people saying, you guys, it's definitely not as bad as you say it is. This is just for people who are in unbearable suffering at the end of their life, and who are we to say that they should suffer more? And then the other 50% of our emails were saying, it's so bad, but it's much worse than you think, and here's my outrageous story. And we thought, boy, we've got to use the 50% of these people to inform the other 50%. And it was the reason the documentary sort of came to life the way it did.
You touch on this there, and I think the documentary deals with this complexity to some extent as well. There's more of a spectrum of opinions on this than a binary. I mean, you certainly have your people that are against any MAiD whatsoever, any assisted suicide whatsoever. And then you get people on the other side that, the quote unquote dying with dignity people that basically think it should be no different than, ordering a book off Amazon. You just one day say, I want it. There are a lot of shades of gray in this. And people that, for example, would have no issue or at least no legal issue with someone that fits how it was originally presented, someone who is terminally ill, they're in a lot of pain, people know with near certainty they're going to die, things will not improve, and they voluntarily and of sound mind make the decision, versus what we're seeing now, which is an expansion to minors, potentially an expansion to people who have a mental illness, which is by definition a disease of the mind. So you've raised your hand there and acknowledged, where you fit on this. But how do you deal with that issue of where there are people that, are fine with it to a point, but not the point that the government is taking it?
We included their voices in the documentary. We tried to make the documentary as accessible as possible for
and I should think your co-producer himself is not as black and white as you are on this.
That's exactly it. And that's why I love working with Kian, is because he comes to these documentaries with a very open mind. He's there to learn. He's there to listen. And, as I do with everything at Rebel News, I lead with my chin. I tell you exactly where I'm coming from. But we did include the voices of the people who would be okay with MAiD under the first track, that where death is imminent, people are suffering from a terminal illness, and their suffering is, according to them, unbearable. We included, for example, Michelle Sterling. People may know her as the communications director of Friends of Science. And her story was so important because her brother was suffering from a terminal degenerative illness, and he chose MAiD. And the family was very involved. They were not shut out of it. There were interviews to make sure there were no evidence of coercion taking place. It was a very holistic approach. Now, whether you agree with that or not, that's up to the individual. But even for Michelle, where her brother accessed MAiD versus where it is now. She says in the documentary, I'm mortified. I'm horrified that this is where it's gotten. And so for, religious pro-lifers like me, we were always talking about the slippery slope. We have to show where it started, and now we're showing where it's ending.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the responses to this, which is that the second category that we described is an inevitability from the first. And I think you look at a lot of the activists on this, originally when this was coming up before the Supreme Court, going back to the Rodriguez case, but more recently the Charter case, they kept it so narrow. And then the second they got that, it all of a sudden expanded. This is too restrictive. It's too difficult. We need to bring it more. And at a certain point, what's the next frontier? Because I actually don't believe we've hit rock bottom on this.
Not even close. Not even close. So the next frontier, I think, is probably mature minors. We've seen some precedent for that in recent Canadian history, where we have activists saying, yes, it is completely up to a 16-year-old to make all sorts of irreversible medical decisions about their body with regard to gender transition. So that's already out there. We also know that during the pandemic, there was this push to say that kids can go behind their parents' backs and get vaccinated. And if you look at what's happening in some of the other extreme MAiD regimes of the world, and I hate even calling it MAiD. It's euthanasia. It's government killing is what it really is. MAiD is just a euphemism to hide exactly what this is. But if we look at some of these other jurisdictions, we have followed in their footsteps almost directly. And so in Holland and Belgium, they are already euthanizing mature minors, and they are also euthanizing people who are just done with living. There's nothing wrong with them. They're not depressed. They're not anything. They're just over it. And so they are euthanizing those people too. And what we've seen Belgium and Holland take 2 decades to get to, we've accelerated into it in 5-6 years.
It's easy to look at Justin Trudeau and say all sorts of things about him and his government on this, but do you get a sense from your research of the why? Of what is it about the fabric of Canada that made us, basically the leader in a category I don't think we want to be leaders in on this issue, even, surpassing in some cases, certainly catching up to these European countries that always used to seem a world away when we did that comparison.
Yeah, I think, and I'm speculating here. I don't really know what's going on in the mind of Justin Trudeau. I don't know if Justin Trudeau knows what's going on in the mind of Justin Trudeau most days. But I think we've got a couple of different things at play here. So we've got a socialized healthcare system where rationing is built in. And with rationing comes delays in care. And with delays in care comes suffering. And so there has to be a solution to that suffering. And so a lot of people are opting to die rather than continue to wait and languish in the pain and suffering that our socialized medical system is offering them. So that's the thing, that this tidies up some wait lines with access to care. But also we've got this extreme focus on equality at all costs. And what I mean by that is the reason that MAiD is being expanded to encompass the mentally ill is this idea of recognizing the equality of suffering. So we've already said, look, if you're suffering from a physical, biological illness that is irremediable, then you should have access to government-assisted suicide. And so the health minister has said, well, we recognize that your mental suffering is completely on par with this irremediable physical suffering. And so thanks to this radical equality, we have to consider both illnesses to be the same. And so that's where we are now.
There's also an aspect culturally in Canada that I would posit and solicit your feedback on, which is that the government control of healthcare, the centralization of healthcare in Canada has, in a lot of ways, taken that moral ownership of healthcare away from Canadians. And some people are willingly going along with this. A lot of people will, cling to the Canadian healthcare system with their dying breath, ironically enough, even if the healthcare system contributed to the dying breath. But you have others that are frustrated with it. But regardless, we use... how often is a policy in Canada sold to us because, oh, well, if we don't do this, it's going to cost the healthcare system. If we don't do this, it's the justification for restrictions on junk food. It's the justification for everything. It's, well, we have to pay for the healthcare. So I think there is a cynicism that is fairly well supported in that, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, we just went through 3 years of lockdowns, and they said our strained healthcare system that we all have to pay for would not survive unless we listened to the guy in the white coat, or in Alberta's case, the lady with the harsh bangs at the podium every day telling us exactly what we needed to do to protect the healthcare system. So we have a society of, and there are still people doing those things, despite the fact that we are hearing more and more every day that the restrictions, by and large, didn't work and were just pulled out of the ether one day and then proliferated across society. And we were all following the lines on the floor as though the COVID only traveled in one direction, past the craft dinner. And so we've got an entire society of people who are still doing those things, meaning they are completely unskeptical about the guy in the white coat telling them what needs to happen with their health. And that worries me. That worries me because there's this sort of sinister passive suggestion to some people that we've heard about that, well, you know what? You're going to be suffering. You don't have long left. Listen to me. I'm a doctor. Maybe you should consider MAiD. That worries me because we have a story in our documentary of a family who were complete COVID skeptics. And thanks to their skepticism of doctors on TV and doctors saying things to them that didn't make sense, their grandma is alive today. Because she was sent to palliative care and she was suggested MAiD. And they said, no. And they kept going and going and going until they got an opinion that they thought made sense. And thanks to that, she's alive today. But on the flip side, we know now that there's a huge segment of the population that are just ready and willing to go along with the doctor in the white coat, no matter what that doctor says.
That story you shared from the documentary was quite a gripping one, where you had, multiple people in the healthcare system that had literally just, sentenced this woman to death by saying that, oh yeah, she's going to die, using that to then justify the idea that, oh well, death is imminent. So, and again, they just knew instinctively that something about that didn't make sense. And, there she was sitting down talking to you however long later. One thing I'm just curious about, because you, again, raised your hand on that, absolutist position on MAiD. Mm-hmm. You've also been unequivocal on, the issue of bodily autonomy throughout COVID. And I'm curious for you how you draw a line between the two, because this is where my libertarianism butts up against my belief in life as well, is that in the case with someone completely of sound mind, how do you say you shouldn't have this tool available to you legally?
Okay, so for me, the issue of bodily autonomy is also the same issue. Your natural life. For me, it's that I believe in the dignity of human life, and I believe in the integrity of the human body. And so I don't find my two positions indistinguishable. I think they're the same position. I don't think the government should be helping people die. It's terrible that we cannot prevent people from taking their own life. I think in our documentary, we offer solutions. Instead of waiting around for the government to change the culture around MAiD, we can do that in our own communities. But of course, I believe in bodily autonomy. I don't think the government should be telling you what to do with your body, but I also believe in the dignity and the value of the human being. And so that's kind of how I get my head around these two issues.
And even the dignity point is incredibly important, because even if one were to accept as a premise that there should be certain circumstances under which MAiD is legal and available, how many people of those who choose that would go that road if they were treated with dignity, if they felt like they had access to palliative care, if they felt they had a support system around them, if all of the options available were shared with them. And I think that's so key. And you see that same discussion with abortion, which is that, again, even if you believe it should be there as a point of last resort, a lot of people will not choose that if they have access to information along the way about alternatives.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, we don't discuss what palliative care is. It's a 50-year medical discipline, and it is making advances all the time in pain management. And so we have a lot of people in Canada who are scared about suffering, about the end of life. And look, I'll lead with my chin. I'm Catholic. We lean into the suffering, right? So I'm not scared of that. But I know a lot of people are scared of the pain of the end of life. And that is changing rapidly. And instead of putting money into palliative care, we're taking money out of palliative care to fund MAiD. And I think that is a great tragedy.
Sheila Gunn Reid, one of the producers of the newish documentary. It's not as new, but like I said, I wanted to see it first, and then I learned I could see it in person, so I wanted to do that. But it's called MAiD, The Dark Side of Canadian Compassion. Thank you so much for reaching out to me and allowing me to be a part of that in my own little way, Sheila. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And Andrew, just thank you so much for being so raw and honest with us in that documentary. Your perspective was so vital to shed light on just, the other side of the mental health issue.
It's kind of you to say. Thank you very much. And I will say I was mortified. Thanks again, Sheila, for when I went to the screening in Elmer. It was hosted at the Church of God in Elmer. And I was wearing the same shirt that I was wearing when Sheila interviewed me for the documentary. And that was like the first thing I thought of. I'm like, oh no, everyone will think I only have one shirt. So anyway, I won't tell you which one. All right, that does it for that segment. I want to move on to another healthcare adjacent piece. We have, you may recall in Canada, you may have forgotten by now, actually, there was that big scandal a couple of years back when you had these two scientists affiliated with the Chinese military that were working at Canada's level 4 lab, the National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg. They were fired, police escorted them out, and the government was then so transparent about all of the... Oh, wait, no. Sorry, I think they actually tried to cover it up and fought their own Speaker of the House in court to prevent any information coming out. Does that sounds more right? Yeah, it's amazing how little we know, even years later, about what exactly went down there. The RCMP claim they are still in the process of investigating it. This whole saga was very adequately captured by a series over at the C2C Journal. Now, this piece, I think, was quite fascinating. The scandal at Canada's National Microbiology Laboratory. It's called The Scientist Who Came In From the Cold. Peter Sean Taylor, who wrote this over at C2C Journal, joins me now. Peter, good to talk to you again. Thanks for coming on today.
Oh, it's always a pleasure to be here, Andrew.
This is one of these stories where, front page news one day just seems to have become a distant memory within a couple. And I mean, even when I read your piece, I've had, many other news stories pop up on my radar since. And it was like, oh yeah, we never really did get to the bottom of that, did we?
No, well, you need a program for all the national security scandals going on. And this one, which I think in any other era would consume us for months and months. As you're right, it was a week or two, and it was disappeared, and now it's been replaced with Chinese government interference in the 2019-2021 election, and then our MPs spying on Canada. So we've had a huge cycle of these sorts of national security crises. But I mean, the Winnipeg lab scandal to me is really quite concerning, and it speaks to many disconcerting things going on in Canada right now. And it's a bit of a shame, perhaps, that it's dropped so low on the attention span of the country.
One of the things, not that I believe Canada should ever aspire to be like China, the old, line of Justin Trudeau's admiring their basic dictatorship, but there is an incredible double standard there. And the way China deals with, as you note in your piece, even minor security infractions. I mean, remember the whole Two Michaels thing came about because China accused these men of spying. And then you contrast that with, the way that Chinese espionage attempts in Canada are treated, and it is an afterthought. I mean, police are still investigating with no sign of whether they'll ever do anything resembling a charge. And again, I'm not saying we should strive to be like China, but man, if the roles were reversed, I would be praying nonstop for whatever Canadian was implicated in spying in a Chinese lab.
Well, I don't know that it's aspiring to be like China, but surely any country that's concerned for its own well-being is going to want to crack down on spies, at least send a signal to the rest of the world that this isn't behavior that we condone. But what did happen in the example of these two scientists? Well, we found out in 2018 that there was something suspicious going on. It took us a year and a half to take away their security clearance. It took 2.5 years to actually fire them. And then when we had what seems to me pretty clear proof that they were spies in the conventional sense, that they were taking Canadian secrets and giving them to another country, we didn't even bother to arrest them. And it appears that we just let them go back to China, where they seem to be living quite comfortable lives, working in their preferred occupations. The fact that they did leave during a COVID lockdown when China had claimed its borders were closed actually suggests that there could have been some kind of deal between Canada and China to quietly let them depart. So, I mean, that's really concerning. Any country, spying should be unacceptable to any country. You don't have to aspire to China to say that we should crack down on spies. We're just sort of failing at the very basic level of protecting our own national security.
Well, and one thing we've seen in the past, and I'd say the government has become reluctantly harsher on China in the last couple of years, probably post Two Michaels, but going back as early as, basically the beginning of the Trudeau government, there so much was overlooked because the government just wanted to get this trade deal with China. And China was, not won over by this. China exploited this, as they do every other vulnerability in the world.
Absolutely. And I think you could argue that deference is still ongoing today. When you look at the foreign interference inquiry, is it deliberate or is it inadvertent? It just briefings, the CSIS briefings seem to be just routinely ignored within the bureaucracy and the Liberal government because they don't put very much interest in it. So whether that's deferring to Chinese interests or it's simply dropping the ball, it's unclear. But there is no real attention in Canada to take national security issues seriously, and that's what really comes through strongly in this Winnipeg lab scandal.
I spoke to Sam Cooper, formerly of Global News, now with the Bureau, about foreign interference last week. And one of the points he raised is that we just don't have the legal mechanisms available to do what we need to do to protect Canada from foreign interference. Now, that's looking at it in an election context, in a democracy context. But if we apply that same thesis here, do we have here a breakdown of the system, or do we have a system that is just not built to deal with this?
Well, I mean, the easiest way to answer that question is look what they do in the U.S. And ask your counterfactual, not what China would have done if they had discovered this breach at their highest security biohazard laboratory, but ask what would have happened in the U.S. if it had been discovered that a couple of Chinese researchers were sending secrets back to China. They would have been arrested. There would have been DOJ and FBI news releases. There would have been all sorts of attention paid. It would have properly been treated as a scandal. There's a long list of, one of the background issues in this was whether the two scientists were participants in what's called the 1,000 Talents program in China, where Western researchers are paid quite handsomely to transfer knowledge they gain back to China by whatever means. It's a thinly veiled form of industrial espionage. The FBI has a very active campaign cracking down on anyone. And the former head of Harvard's chemistry department was recently, last year, was sentenced for participating in a talents program. So during the Trump era, they canceled the visas of 1,000 Chinese researchers who had connections back to Chinese military institutions, which was again the case in the Winnipeg scandal here. So you look at our closest neighbor, and they don't have any time for this kind of business. They deal with it very harshly, and I think that's the example we should be following. There's no question that the Americans wouldn't stand for this at all.
So moving forward here, are you an optimist or a pessimist on this? Because I know you're doing your, I think, very important work in drawing attention to this, but, you know, even from the Conservatives, we just don't hear this issue discussed anymore. As you mentioned, there have been a lot of sexier and fresher issues that have taken the oxygen out. And, you know, do you think this is possible to fix, basically?
I mean, I like to think of myself as an optimist in general. Maybe my work experience intrudes on that. Well, I guess, you know, the government itself claims that they've fixed all the security lapses that have been identified by this issue, and that they're checking people's security clearance much more tightly. So perhaps there's been a within the bureaucracy itself, because that's one of the parts of this scandal, is the bureaucracy basically let these two scientists, particularly Xu, do whatever they want because they valued the research and the international collaboration much more highly than they did their role as a national security institution. So perhaps there's been some salutary effect on the bureaucracy. I find it hard to believe that there's been a real change of thinking at the federal liberal level. They're so wedded to this idea that China is going to let them in, so to speak, at some point, and they're going to reap all the benefits from all the deference for all this time. So at that broader level, I think it's going to take a change in government to really elevate national security matters in Canada. But it is possible that at the micro level, security procedures have been toughened up at not only the Winnipeg lab, but perhaps other sensitive federal institutions around the country.
Yeah, and I think people need to understand, at the very least, the institutional vulnerabilities that do exist to China. I mean, academia is a tremendous example of this. The number of these so-called research partnerships that have put Chinese researchers, and again, state-affiliated, military-affiliated researchers on key projects here. And I noted that when the foreign registry was floated in politics, you had universities in Canada last week saying, "Ooh, well, we think this might jeopardize our research partnerships." And you're like, exactly, that's the point of it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, it's certainly not just government. It's private sector, it's universities. Mm-hmm. I mean, Xu and Cheng were also jointly appointed at the University of Manitoba. Interestingly enough, though, University cut ties with them almost immediately after these revelations were made, and they were escorted off the lab property, whereas it, you know, as we discussed, it took 2.5 years to actually fire them from the federal government. So yeah, it's not just the federal government. It's all over Canada. I mean, it's all over all Western nations. There was a study out of Australia about the level of Chinese collaboration with universities, and Canada ranked 3rd in total after the US and the UK. So we are certainly an object of interest from China at the university level. And yeah, as you say, there's all sorts of things, not just access to Ebola virus, but all sorts of sensitive and cutting edge technology that may be vulnerable.
It is a fascinating read. It's a lengthy read, but I think a very important one in C2C Journal over different parts there. That's how much content you had to work with here. And I feel you probably still could have gone on and turned this into a book as well. The second part came out a couple of weeks back, The Vials and the Damage Done, Canada's National Microbiology Laboratory Scandal. Peter Sean Taylor from C2C Journal. Always good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Andrew. Anytime.
All right, cheers. That does it for us for today. We have a special edition of the program tomorrow, a full-length interview with John Rustad, the leader of the British Columbia Conservatives, who are finding great success in the polls in BC and have become quite an unlikely success story in BC politics if you talk to certain people. That's tomorrow. And I'll also be at the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms George Jonas Freedoms Award dinner tomorrow night as well. So I'll probably see some of you there. But in the meantime, thank you, God bless, and good day to you all.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.
Mm-hmm.